Well, we've been working on to a series, and it's been kind of taking our way through the Sermon on the Mount, because in it we see Jesus give his revolutionary message to his disciples about his vision for them and for them to understand their place in his kingdom. And so that's why we've called the series The Revolution. And when Jesus is on that mount, talking to his disciples, he's casting this vision, and that they would be salt and light. Salt and light. Now, what does that mean, salt? Do you remember what we said about that when we were talking about it? What does that mean, salt, to be salt?
Prevent decay.
To prevent decay? Right. That's the idea. That we live in a world, doesn't matter where you live in the world, because every culture suffers under the burden of sin, that we live in a decaying world. Socially, culturally, societal. We live in one that's decaying under the weight of sin. It's coming apart. Relationships are breaking. Connections are breaking. Things are falling apart. And salt is there to preserve it. And so when you add somebody of the character of a disciple, they have a positive influence in the world. In their family, in their workplace, at their school, wherever they might be. God can use them to preserve and keep the sin from continuing to grow and to cause things to fall apart. So it's that, and it's also light. He said, and so what is that about? What is that image of light? A person that's supposed to be salt and light. What does light contrast with? Darkness, right. Contrast with darkness. Because we live in a world that's, doesn't know light, doesn't know truth. It's covered up in lies and continually tries to deceive us about what our priorities should be and how we should treat our spouses and how we should be in our workplace and all around. But the world needs light. It needs truth. And so that's the positive impact we're supposed to have in the world as disciples. And Jesus, that's his vision for his disciples. To be salt and light in the world. And we were talking about it because Jesus was going through all these examples in the sermon, and then he starts talking about, he kind of shifts, and then he starts talking about there's going to be a conflict. There's going to be an issue that you're going to have to deal with because there's going to be a hardship in maintaining the vision. And we talked about it last week, and he said it's going to revolve around where we start with an M. Do you remember what it was? What's going to be the conflict?
What now? Say that question again. This
Okay.
was last week.
Yeah.
Materialism.
Yeah, materialism. Yeah, that's going to be something that's going to be hard for the disciples. Doesn't matter what generation they're in. Doesn't matter what part of the world they're in. That's going to be something they're going to have to deal with. Materialism. Because that's going to have a pull on you. Because there's a compulsion to chase the abundance. And this is why Jesus puts it this way, he says, do not treasure up for yourselves treasure on earth, but treasure up treasures in heaven. Because what we have the compulsion to do is that we look at our world and we go, okay, the best way for me to survive here, the best thing I can do, the smart thing to do, the thing I can secure myself in, is I need to chase the abundance. I need to go after it. I need to, treasure up these treasures. I need to have these possessions, whether it be money or just some other kind of form. That's what that drive we have is. And it's chasing the abundance. And Jesus warns us about that. But because he says, where your treasure is, there what is? Your heart. Right. Where your treasure is, there your heart is. And so all of that compulsiveness, all that chasing this abundance, what that ends up doing, it ends up getting your heart. Because you've got so much invested in it. It just makes sense. I mean, you put a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of energy to amass these possessions, money, whatever. You've invested a lot. So it shouldn't surprise us at all that Jesus would say, your heart goes the same place. You love it. And that's what we were talking about last week. Now this week, I just wanted to throw out there kind of a poll question, and you'll kind of see why in a second. But think about this. If you think about the stress, the anxiety that we have today, day-to-day life, it's just a part of, the world you live in right here and now. Okay? The day-to-day stress, the day-to-day anxiety, the tension. Do you think all of that is the same as it used to be in the past, is more than it used to be in the past, or less than the past? See that all the stress and anxiety that you deal with, that normal people deal with in day-to-day life, right here, right now, when you look back in the past, okay, another generation, was it the same then, or was it less then? Or was it more then? How many people think it was the same then, just a different way? How many people think it was the same? Okay. How many people think it was more then? Okay. Now, how many people think it was less then? Okay. That's kind of a little bit of a split right there. So there's kind of a little bit of a discussion that we need to have, because we look at all the stress and anxiety and go, okay, was it the same then? We don't really think that. We think it was either more then or less then. That's how we kind of come down on it. If, we take the polls, accurately. It was either less than or more than. But here's the thing: no matter the case, we still have to deal with it right now, because certain kind of stresses and anxieties and tensions, they can manipulate us. They can push us to do things that we wouldn't normally do. They can kind of bully us around to do certain things and make certain choices. We get manipulated by it. And this is what happens with materialism. We get manipulated by materialism. Because we get drawn into, I got to work this overtime, because I got to have this. And I got to go into debt more, because I want to have that. And if I just squeeze in this, then I can afford that. And maybe I just need to forget about my family for a little while and concentrate on my career. We can make all these kind of judgments because we're being manipulated by the stress and the anxiety that generates of chasing the abundance. We feel like we have to do it. And so what we want to talk about today is being free from that. And so that's our focus. Freedom from materialism. That's our focus today. Freedom from materialism. Freedom from materialism. That's what we're going to talk about. That's what we're going to see how Jesus discusses this issue and how he develops that idea and what we need to learn from it. Freedom from materialism. Because it's going to weigh on us. It's going to be stressful. There's going to be tension. There's going to be anxiety. There's no way around it, because it has a way of manipulating us, of weighing us down. But we can have freedom from materialism. Freedom from materialism. Say that with me. Freedom from materialism. One more time. Freedom from materialism. So if you're off somewhere later on and somebody asks you what was today's message about, you can say freedom from materialism. And you already have it in a nutshell. Freedom from materialism. Because we need freedom from it. I saw a thing the other day on Facebook. The guy says, if you're weighed down with stress and anxiety, he says, go buy a new fishing pole. He says, then if it doesn't go away, at least you have a new fishing pole. Like that's going to solve it. Let's look at what the Bible says. So if you have a Bible, can turn to it. We want to go to Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6. Gospel of Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. We're right in the middle now of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. So remember, we just said, when we were looking at a review of some things, we just said that Jesus had warned us that where our treasure is, there our heart would be. Where our treasure is, there our heart would be. Now, if we keep reading how it's developed, next he starts talking about the eye is the lamp of the body, and then he expounds on that. But the idea on that section is basically that materialism and this chasing the abundance that we get into, it can make us greedy. And not only greedy, but it has a way of changing our perception of how things are. It actually is like a lens for us, because that kind of greed gets into our lives and we see things differently when we have that kind of mindset. We see things differently. That should not surprise any of us, because we know when somebody is greedy, they see things differently. They'll do things, they'll say things, they'll lie, they'll cheat, they'll steal, they'll make all kinds of concessions on their character, because the greed is taken over. And they don't see it as a problem anymore, when maybe beforehand they would have been appalled that they would do those kind of things. And so this is what Jesus is talking about. And then he continues, and he expounds on that, and he says, no one, this is verse 24, no one can serve two masters. And then right there he's talking about how this kind of compulsion that pulls at us makes us give over our devotion to our possessions. You can't serve God and mammon. You're making it an idol. And so it has our heart, makes us greedy, changes our perception of things, and now he says it becomes an idol to you. It becomes a master to you. So he's just developing all of this in a big way, kind of as a warning, telling us what we're dealing with, about the kind of effect it can have on our lives. Now, here's the thing. A lot of you, maybe most of you, when you think about this, you go, yeah, I've seen that. Maybe my brother does that, or maybe my dad did that, or maybe, my neighbor does that. I've seen that. Maybe I've been tempted at times to be that way. But that's not really a struggle for me. I'm not out here doing whatever I can to amass a bunch of possessions, to get rich, to have more money than the next person. That's not me. And Jesus would say, keep listening, because this is what he says next. Verse 25. And we're going to follow this from 25 to 33. Verse 25, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more important than food, and the body, and more important than clothes? See, now he's talking about something else we have to deal with in this realm of materialism, and it's not chasing the abundance. It's about worry. And worry is about fearing the absence. Worrying is about looking into the future, whether it be next day or next week or next month or however it might be. It's looking forward and being anxious about it. That's why sometimes your translations may use the word anxious instead of worry, because the way it's translated in the Greek. This Greek word about worry is connected, it's called merimna, and it's connected to the idea of fear. And it's also connected to the idea, or associated with, being sleepless. Like you're so worried about not having the things that you need you up at night. It's wearing you down. It's breaking you down. It's too much. And so this is where a lot of us fall in at. We may not be the person chasing the abundance. We're the one fearing the absence of it. We're the ones worried, staying up at night. We're the ones scratching our head looking at the checkbook. We're the ones, looking up to the sky whenever that credit card bill comes in. That's us more often than not. We start to worry, is there going to be the things that I need? What's tomorrow going to bring? What's the next week going to bring? What's the next month going to bring? And so that's where the worry is generated from. And we find ourselves here, fearing the absence. And Jesus says, I tell you, do not worry about your life. Jesus says, don't worry about your life. Now, look at the kind of things he mentions when he's telling them not to worry about. He says, do not worry about what you will eat, drink, about your body, and parenthetically also what you will wear. Is life not more important than the food, the body more important than the clothes? These kinds of things Jesus are describing. What kind of things are these? Food, clothing.
Necessities.
Yeah, exactly. Necessities. These are not luxuries. These are necessities. These are essentials. I mean, these are basic stuff. Now, that probably points us to a little bit about this context, this first century, Israel context. The disciples hearing them, it wasn't probably because they had a lot of luxuries. This was probably, what they were experiencing more than anything else. But also, you have to think, if somebody can trust God faithfully with the necessities, they don't have any trouble trusting Him with the luxuries. Because if I know He's going to take care of my needs, I don't have to worry about the luxuries of life. He's got me taken care of. He's got those needs taken care of. And so this is what Jesus is telling us about fearing the absence of these basic things. These not extravagant things, these basic things. And that's what really pulls at us. And when we see ourselves in the middle here, we go, well, okay, this is one way, it's pulling me in this direction, but that's not me so much. And then we go, well, this is kind of what I have experienced in my life. That's really my end of things. It's not so much the other. But here's the thing. We think it's like this. We think, you're either pulled in one direction because of materialism or you're pulled in the other. But really, it's like this. They're both pulling us in the same direction. You're dealing with both, whether you realize it or not. This is a much bigger problem than you think. This is a much more present problem than you haven't estimated. This is much more part of your life than you understand. It's not that materialism is pulling you one way or the other. It's that both these things are pulling at you. I'll give you an example. I'd seen a movie years ago, and some of y'all may recognize it, called The Cinderella Man. Anybody recognize that movie? Cinderella Man? You recognize it? Cinderella Man's a great story. It's based on a true story. And the movie is basically this boxer back during the Great Depression, so it's like early 1930s, something like that. He's a boxer, and he's basically been put out of boxing because of his injuries. Well, then the Depression hits. Whole nation is in this kind of downturn, and the only skill he had was fighting, boxing, and he was put out of it. And so he's going around, he's got these two kids and a wife trying to support, and he's going around in the midst of the Depression, big city problems as well. He's going around trying to find a job. And man, there ain't no jobs. They're closing up. They're shut down. They don't have anything for him. And his little son, looks like he's like maybe 6 years old, he comes home one day after spending all day looking for a job. He comes home and he finds out his little son has this food that he's been hoarding. And they didn't have enough food to hoard. His little son had been stealing from the local fruit market and bringing it home, hiding it. And he takes him, he gets very serious with him, this boxer, the dad does. He gets very serious with him. He says, "We don't steal, son. We don't steal." And the son, in tears, he goes, "Yes." He goes, "Why did you do this? Were you hungry?" You come to find out, the little boy says, "Well, I see all my friends, and when their parents can't make it any longer, and their dad and mom don't have jobs, and they don't have any food in the cupboard, those kids get sent off. They get sent off to other family members. They get sent off to some other place." And that little boy didn't want to see that happen. So that's why he was stealing food. What do we do when we fear the absence? Well, if it pushes us hard enough, we'll break all kind of rules. We'll hoard. If it pushes us hard enough, if it really works on us, if we're really worried and anxious about, am I going to be able to pay this bill? Am I going to be able to live in this house? Am I going to be able to keep this car? Am I going to have a retirement? Whatever else, if we're really worried about it, we'll start breaking those rules. And we'll start feeling like, I need to hoard something. I need to put it away. See, this is working at us. Materialism is working at us all the time. It's either in the form of chasing the abundance or fearing the absence. It's always working on us, whether we realize it or not. And so when Jesus expounds on this, he starts explaining reasons why they shouldn't be so caught up in this. And he goes on and he talks about, how God provides for creation. And he starts talking about how, worrying is not going to add anything to your life. You can sit around and worry about it all you want. It's not going to change the circumstances. Worrying doesn't change circumstances. And so he's developing this and going on, and he starts in verse 32. He says, he even compares that idea to pagans. He says, the people that don't even know God, he says, that's the kind of thing they do. They respond in a certain way to these things because they don't even know God. And so he calls the disciples to respond differently. In verse 33, though, is where Jesus resolves the issue for them. Verse 33, it says, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you. All these essentials, all these necessity things. He says, if you put your devotion where it needs to be, trust God to take care of the rest. If you put your devotion where it needs to be, trust God to take care of the rest. Your worrying ain't going to do good. Jesus just explained all that. Your worry doesn't change any of your circumstances. He says, but put your devotion where it needs to be. Don't be a product of these things pulling at you. Now, when we look at it, basically, we might think, well, Jesus is calling us to redirect our attention. Our attention may be our worry and anxiety. Our attention may be, our possessions and this kind of stuff. That may get our attention, and Jesus is calling us to seek first. He's calling us to redirect our attention. But there's more to it than that. Because, you all know, there's lots of good, productive ways that people can redirect their attention and, have some success. Somebody who's trying to give up smoking, they'll redirect their attention to something else. Somebody trying to give up, binge eating. They'll redirect their attention to something else. You know, all these kind of things can be dealt with like that by redirecting our attention. But Jesus is getting beyond that. It's not just redirecting it to anything. It's to God's kingdom and His righteousness. He's turning our attention to God's will. And that's where the power is. Turning to God. Redirecting our attention from our anxieties, from our compulsions, redirecting them to God. Because here's the thing. What does it say in the book of James? It says, draw closer to God and what? Remember? If you draw close to God, He will draw closer to you. See, that's where the power is. It's not just in the redirecting. It's not just getting your mind off of it. It's that you're doing something purposeful. You are turning in God's direction. You're drawing yourself into that relationship. You're seeking first His will. You're putting it on the line. You're turning to Him, and He's turning to you. Seek first. Jesus said. Because you'll seek first, and you'll find freedom. If you seek first, you'll find freedom. It's not just because you turned it away from the bad habit and the wrong ideas and all. It's that you turn towards God, and He's the source of the power you need. He's the source of the power that you're longing for. He's the answer. These other things you're trying to plug in there because you're insecure about money. You're insecure about your possessions and all these other things you're trying to feed that with. And Jesus is saying, you want to find freedom? Seek first. Put that at the top of your list. Make that the top of your devotion. Seek first and find freedom. That's what He calls us to do. Seek first and find freedom. Say that with me. Seek first and find freedom. One more time. Seek first and find freedom. You know, Paul's letter he writes, and he says, the Philippians, he says, I can do all things through Christ. All things. And you're reading, well, you know, that gets quoted. A lot of people think, well, you know, what all is Paul talking about? You know what he's talking about in that context? He's talking about contentment. That's the big thing he's struggling with. That's the big, you know, thing he's trying to deal with and has to overcome. Because Paul has been in jail cells and Paul has been in luxury. And what's the thing he has to deal with in his life and to manage and to turn towards God for help? It's just to be content wherever he's at, with wherever God has him. Because that's what Paul is doing. He's continually seeking God's will. And it's when we seek first that we can find freedom from those anxieties, those worries. We'll have the freedom we need. We'll have the contentment we need. As the music plays, that's what I want to put on your heart this morning. Because whether it be your health or your money or your bank account or your mortgage or some other thing in your life, I'm sure you have plenty to worry about if you really want to. You probably could write a list. But worry doesn't help anything. But you can grow through that process of seeking first. And you can find freedom in the midst of whatever storm, whether it be an absence, or whether it be dealing with the compulsion of abundance. You can find the freedom you need.